In the final days of the European theater of World War II, one of the most ruthless and brutal battles of the entire war took place. Berlin, which for years had served as Hitler's Nazi metropolis, had now become a battlefield, reduced to ruins and engulfed in flames. The Soviet Red Army pushed the German Wehrmacht and Axis forces back into the heart of Hitler's government, preparing for combat in an underground complex known as the Führer Bunker. In Berlin, Hitler prepared for his own death while intense street fighting took place around the remnants of the Nazi government. The Red Army suffered around 80,000 casualties, while the Germans lost about 100,000 soldiers. Additionally, the Germans had to face the reality that a large number of civilians had been killed, and approximately 500,000 people were captured by the Soviets. The battle around the Reich Chancellery was the most brutal part. Some people even chose suicide, unable to imagine life without Hitler's leadership. However, for civilians in Berlin, one of the greatest fears was the horror brought by the Soviet Red Army. The reputation and actions of the Soviet soldiers led to numerous horrific crimes against women in the German capital. These women endured unspeakable suffering. Welcome to today's video. In this episode, we will examine the plight of German women during the Battle of Berlin. Adolf Hitler was last seen on his 56th birthday, April 20th, 1945, inside the crumbling ruins of the Reich Chancellery. This once grand Nazi government building was now in a state of total destruction. Hitler's closest allies gathered around him, and for many it was the last time they would meet, knowing that the war was coming to an end and attempting to escape their fate. By this time, the Soviet Red Army had already planned the encirclement of Berlin, and artillery fire had begun bombarding Hitler's capital. Many famous buildings were hit. In the following days, Hitler lost his grip on reality inside his bunker, eventually admitting to himself that the war was lost and preparing for his own death. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels continued to rally people to fight and sacrifice their lives for Hitler's cause. He called upon the city's residents and did everything he could to encourage them, even arming children with rocket-propelled weapons to fight against Soviet tanks. One witness to the chaos recalled, "We saw walls of buildings hastily painted with Goebbels' messages in white. Every German will defend his capital. The Red Horde will be stopped before the Berlin Wall." But nothing could stop the Soviet advance. Concrete fortifications, barricades, mines, and even suicide squads wielding grenades were all swept aside by the overwhelming Red Army. A light drizzle began to fall near Bielitzsdorf. I saw the artillery preparing to fire. I asked the artillery commander, "What is the target?" He replied, "The city center of Berlin, the Spree bridges, the Northern and Stettin railway station." Then a powerful order rang out, "Fire at the fascist German capital." I checked my watch. It was April 2nd, 8:30 a.m. Within minutes, 96 shells rained down on the center of Berlin. Along with the devastation caused by Soviet artillery, the behavior of Red Army soldiers entering the city was equally horrifying. Reports indicate that many German women, particularly those who remain in East Prussia, were targeted by Soviet soldiers. News of these events and other wartime reports spread through Berlin, inciting terror. Although Soviet command had issued orders instructing soldiers to direct their hatred toward enemy combatants rather than women, these efforts had little effect. Discipline within the Red Army was extremely weak. Many Soviet soldiers saw the attack on Berlin as ultimate revenge for the atrocities committed by Germans during Operation Barbarossa. It is important to remember that Nazi death squads followed behind the advancing Wehrmacht, rounding up men, women, and children, forcing them to dig mass graves, and executing them in those pits. Many Soviet soldiers, driven by a desire for revenge, viewed Berlin's women as targets, almost as trophies to be plundered. They justified their actions as payback for the crimes committed by the Germans in previous years. One Soviet soldier reportedly said, "Our soldiers' actions toward German women are completely justified." It was an unprecedented mass assault. No woman was safe. Allegedly, Soviet soldiers attacked every German female between the ages of 8 and 80. These women were caught in the final chaos of World War II, while their husbands, partners, and family members were forced to fight for Hitler's collapsing regime. Making matters worse, many Soviet soldiers consumed any alcohol they could find, rampaging through the city in search of women to attack. They committed countless crimes. It is estimated that around 200,000 children were born to German mothers and Soviet fathers, most as a result of violent assaults. Women were powerless. Soldiers sought to humiliate and take revenge on them, treating them as war prizes. A Soviet general described the chaotic scene in Berlin. A group of 35 cadet officers and their commander entered a women's dormitory, but stopped in horror at what they witnessed. Many women lost their lives at the hands of Soviet soldiers, either killed after being used or left to die. One Soviet soldier, fighting near Berlin, claimed that his unit encountered armed German women who declared they were avenging their fallen husbands. These women were executed without hesitation. The soldier recalled suggesting they be shot immediately rather than killed with bayonets. The fear in these women's faces told him everything about what had happened during the first night of the Soviet occupation of Berlin. Shocking and horrifying events continued every night the Red Army remained in the city. In one area of Berlin, Soviet officers entered a Catholic orphanage supervised by nuns. They initially behaved well, but warned that the next wave of soldiers would not be so kind. When the second wave arrived, young women, elderly women, pregnant women, mothers with newborns, and the nuns were all terrorized. Many women hid in air raid shelters. When Soviet soldiers approached, they searched for women, dragging them from hiding places and selecting victims to abuse before discarding them in the devastated city. Some women were also beaten and tortured, while others realized that aligning with a high-ranking Soviet officer might be their best chance of survival. A woman named Magda Weller, a 24-year-old actress, was hiding in a closet when a soldier from Central Asia found her. He offered to make her his girlfriend in exchange for protection from other soldiers. However, when he boasted to his comrades, they began searching for her. Certain periods in Berlin were considered so dangerous for women that they were advised never to leave their homes. These hunting hours were when Soviet soldiers roamed the streets looking for victims. Some parts of the day were considered slightly safer because soldiers were still sleeping or hungover. Many women screamed in agony as Soviet artillery pounded the city. Hospitals were overwhelmed with victims. A doctor estimated that 100,000 women in Berlin were assaulted, with 10,000 dying as a result. Many took their own lives, unable to endure the humiliation. Some men bravely tried to protect the women, but these German men were brutally murdered, sometimes hanged from street lamps or shot and left for dead. For days, the city remained in a state of horror. Women did everything they could to avoid becoming victims. One survivor recalled, "The next morning, we women tried to make ourselves look as unattractive as possible, smearing soot on our faces, wrapping our heads in rags. We huddled in the center of the basement, trembling in fear. Someone peeked through a low basement window and saw the savage, terrifying Mongolian soldiers on the street. We were paralyzed with fear." The Battle of Berlin is often remembered as the last major conflict in Europe during World War II. The women who suffered through it are among the forgotten victims.